It's Earth Day, a concept that was created 50 years ago to draw attention to this precious blue planet we call home, and to narrow our focus on how to ensure its environment remains habitable and healthy for all time. We've come a long way in realizing how our actions affect every single aspect of the elements of Earth, the air, the land, the sea. That drive to protect our home has dominated much of the political discourse of the past 20 years, especially here in Canada. And today, we're 6 days out from the federal election. The environment, while still an issue, has taken a back seat to trade and tariffs. Now, that doesn't mean the environment isn't still on the agenda, but it's clear its place in the election discourse has diminished. Hello, I'm Stuart McNish, and you're listening to Conversations Live. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series addressing the big issues of our time. For each episode, we bring together subject matter experts for a deep conversation designed to provide you with information that helps you make more informed decisions. I hope you enjoy it. Our panel today digs deep into the reality, the challenges, and what we can do to build on the progress that we have made in Canada in the development of sustainable energy generation. Our panel, Professor Mark Jaccard of SFU, is a longtime expert in energy and climate. He's been a contributor to the IPCC and the Royal Society of Canada. Mark is a nonpartisan advisor to all parties in Canada, and he's the author of several books about a path to sustainable energy production and environmental protection. His most recent book is The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success. And Mark, I note in 2006 you also published Sustainable Fossil Fuels, the unusual suspect in the quest for clean and enduring energy. Interesting concept. John Kidder, the Green Party candidate for Mission Matsqui Abbotsford, joins us remotely. Mr. Kidder is one of the founders of the BC Green Party, and he's been a lifelong advocate for the environment. As I say, he's joining us remotely. Tom Hackney of the BC Sustainable Energy Association is also joining us remotely from Victoria. Tom is the policy advisor for the BC Sustainable Energy Association, specializing in high-level energy transformation concepts and utility regulation. Also joining us is Suki Sahota, the representative for the NDP party in Vancouver Granville. And he has been associated with a nonpartisan association that has focused heavily on the environment. Conversations Live. Today we come to you from Kemkemale, the land of many maples. These are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. Osiem. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series that seeks to advance our understanding of the big issues of our times. Our goal is to share ideas that help each of us gain a greater understanding of our communities, our province, and our country. We work in association with Mario Canseco of Research Co., and our media partner is the Vancouver Sun, and live streaming services are provided by Oh Boy Productions. Now, one last little bit of business before we get going. For anybody wishing to submit a question, please go to slido.com, enter the code Conversations Live, and send in your question. I'll receive your questions and share them with our panelists where I can. Now, that said, I may not deliver your question verbatim, but I'll be motivated by your thoughts, and they will help to shape some of the questions that I will present today. So our topic is sustainable energy and the election. Samaya, can you please roll Mario's video to get a sense of how people are feeling about the environment, where we're at, and where we're going?
7 in 10 British Columbians are convinced that climate change is real and is caused by human emissions. BC is home to just under 3 in 10 residents who either think climate change is a fact that is caused by natural changes, or who believe climate change is a theory that has not been proven. In other Canadian provinces, such as Ontario and Alberta, the number of global warming skeptics is markedly higher than in BC. Just under half of BC residents think the fight against climate change must be led by 2 levels of government, federal and provincial. Just over 1 in 10 believe individual citizens and municipal governments should be the ones leading the way, while fewer think this battle should be left in the hands of businesses, international organizations, environmental organizations, or foreign governments. When asked about credible sources of information on climate change and energy, more than 3 in 4 BC residents express confidence in scientists and farmers, while more than 3 in 5 also mention BC Hydro, renewable energy advocates, and environmental organizations. Fewer express confidence in energy utilities, the BC government, First Nations organizations, their municipal government, and the federal government to speak about climate change and energy. The ranking is even lower for industry associations, unions, and oil and gas companies. At least 3 in 4 BC residents hold favorable views about 3 distinct sources of energy that are renewable: solar, offshore wind, and onshore wind, while more than 7 in 10 feel the same way about hydro and tidal. The rating is slightly lower, but still in majority territory, for gas, geothermal, and biomass, while nuclear power is at the bottom of the list, garnering a favorable assessment from fewer than 2 in 5 BC residents. We tested 6 different ideas, and at least 7 in 10 British Columbians endorsed 4 of them: updating building codes to ensure that new construction is energy efficient, giving incentives to homeowners to install heat pumps, focusing on clean energy projects that rely on wind power, and raising the carbon tax for large industrial emitters. The notion of the BC government paying BC businesses to reduce emissions is backed by 63% of residents. The public is not completely sold on the goal of ensuring that 90% of vehicles sold in 2030 are fully electric. Only 41% of BC residents are in favor of this idea. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from ResearchGo.
Thank you, Mario. Now to our panel. Mark, I'd like to start with you because I don't know that there is a clear definition of what sustainable energy is. It often gets conflated with renewable energy, but the two are not the same.
Absolutely. And in fact, someone who's taught sustainable energy for 37 years now, that is one of the things that I address at the very beginning of the course and challenge graduate students, undergraduate students, to say what do we mean by sustainability? And I do that because what you'll realize is that all of our energy choices have impacts. None of them are ideal or perfect. They involve trade-offs. And so, yes, we might say that it's not going to be very sustainable in the long run to burn fossil fuels because of the CO2 emissions and the climate change. But that doesn't mean that you might not use fossil fuels. Maybe they would be the more sustainable option in certain contexts. Now, when you bring out stuff like that, it really gets people going, and I'm happy for us to follow up on that. But if you've asked me for this definition, same with nuclear power, same with all other options. So I am someone who pushes back when someone says renewable equals sustainable. You can have very unsustainable renewable options as well.
John, from your perspective, how would you define sustainable energy?
Well, I think I would define sustainable energy as energy sources that can be relied upon, that we're not going to do damage to the earth, that are going to be able to be available to us for centuries to come. That would help me think of them as sustainable. I'd also think of them as not being sources that are not going to break the bank to put them in place, like there's even prototyping small modular nuclear reactors. If that ever occurs, it's going to cost billions of dollars and take many years. So I think sustainability has, as Mark says, a number of factors around it. Not just renewables, but certainly renewables, in my mind, come to the top from most of the kind of the economic energy calculations I'm able to do. I totally agree with Mark. There will be places for fossil fuels in the world for many, many, many years, but they will not be the dominant source of energy.
I'm surprised to hear that. Suki, what about you? What's your perspective on that?
Well, interesting with what Mark mentioned, that sustainability and renewable sources aren't obviously the same. But to me, my focus is that all renewable sources are sustainable, much more sustainable than non-renewables. Because let's just face it, if we're burning oil, if we're burning coal, gas, it's coming from somewhere. We're depleting resources. So depletion of resources doesn't necessarily equal sustainability, because eventually at some point or another, those resources are going to dry up, as opposed to, say, the renewable aspect, which is ever more sustainable. It keeps going. And the technology, say for the wind power, it keeps things going in the sense that those fan blades keep whirling, They don't really need much human intervention, as opposed to, say, generating oil or pumping oil out the ground, as an example. So I think there's different levels of what you could say sustainability, but I'm very certain that the renewables aspect has definitely more of a focus on its sustainability aspect.
Tom, I'd like to get your sense of where you believe that we can get to with sustainable energy. And I see that you've got a wind generation windmill behind you on the screen.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd like to emphasize the intergenerational equity aspect of sustainability. Sustainable energy, to me, is defined as being energy that can help us today to meet our needs while not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that's where climate change comes in a big way, but also all the other effects that other forms of energy have when we develop the world, and they have impacts.
So to put a question to the panel, and I want to make note that we've got a representative, John Kidder from the Green Party, and Suki Sahota from the NDP. We did put out an invitation to both the Liberals and the Conservatives, and well, they're not here. So what's interesting is... Pardon me?
Sorry, I said quelle surprise that they're not here.
Well, it is a surprise because this has been such a big part of political discourse. And suddenly, and Mark, we were on a panel together, or you were on one of my panels last year, and I asked you, what might happen if the political winds start to change? Does our commitment to the environment remain? And you said absolutely. And I think that for most people, the commitment to the environment does change. But politically, we're seeing it lose some of its luster, shall we say.
Yes, but
what do you think happened?
What I would have said to you is that, in fact, in my career, the interest in acting on climate and pressuring our politicians to do that has gone up and down. And and the challenge with climate and other kinds of global action problems, so they actually need diplomacy to work, which humans are not good at, and then they need us to act over multiple decades to transition capital-intensive systems of energy and cities and so on. Whereas we get great interest in the climate, and then Iraq invades Kuwait in 1991, or you have the Americans, or you have the meltdown in 2008, the financial meltdown, or Americans invading Iraq in 2004. We are always going to have conjunctures in history where we will lose the public will lose interest in the immediacy of climate. And I thought it was really good to have Mario's survey there, because that interest and desire is still there. Also, the other thing that triggers it, of course, is natural events. So fires, floods, you have a few years where you don't have that, inflation and other things. So this is normal. I don't see anything troubling about this.
I'm happy to hear that, because I was concerned that maybe for political expediency, it was slipping away.
Yeah, I would. I think for some people it would be like, gee, I would love it if it just slipped away. But of course, the scientists are probably right, and so it won't slip away. We are going to have worse and worse effects. I'm trusting the general consensus of the scientists. So we don't get to just close our eyes on climate. We may close our eyes temporarily during an election campaign right now because of other things, tariff threats, you name it, but it'll come back. I promise you that, because climate change is not going away.
So what's the best way, and I'll come to you first, Suki, for us to get people to start to move towards a reduction in use of carbon fuels, and then also, and I think equally importantly, and maybe if not more so, the promotion of getting to sustainable energy sources. Does it come from government? As we look at Mario's poll, he says the general public goes, national, provincial governments are the ones who are going to drive this, rather than leaving it to the marketplace and to individuals.
Yep. So the first part of your question, I think first of all, there's misinformation. There's always misinformation, right? And unfortunately, this does play a key role, because when people are misinformed, even if they don't necessarily believe it, they use it for their own advantage, right? And we've seen companies do that as well. But just kind of going back to the point that you made, Mark, just now, I know, yes, things come and go, and obviously now we're all talking about the tariffs, but the problem is that the climate emergency has never gone. It's still existential. And my biggest worry is in regards to this, what we call climate tipping point. Now, there's a very well-known scientist called Johan Rockström, and he has been talking about certain indicators that we are approaching right now, especially in regards to the ocean currents, the AMOC as it's referred to, where we could be getting to a point of no return. So it's even vital that now governments really focus on every policy that they are thinking about implementing has our climate emergency in perspective. And for the NDP specifically, as you did mention, we are focusing on skilling up workers to have that kind of economy, that green economy that we really need. And I'll tell you now, spending $30 billion on a pipeline, which will take 10 years, I don't think is as sustainable as, say, spending that same amount of money and time on a national electricity grid, which actually, makes Canada more secure because it's not right by the border, this pipeline, it's throughout the country. It's going from coast to coast to coast. That then gives us locally, within the provinces, an opportunity to generate our own sources of power. So obviously here in BC, we're on the Pacific coast. We can utilize the tidal energy and the many other forms of energy that is of advantageous for us. In Alberta, we're talking about the sun and so forth. So we really need to have that ability for a national infrastructure that focuses or gives the potential focus for provinces and municipal leaders to do that local bit too.
So John, I see that you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I have a couple of things I'd like to say. First, going back to the question of what happens to public interest. I think one of the things that's happened here is we don't properly give people an understanding of how the cost of living, which is dominating today's conversation, is connected to the climate crisis. And if we don't make that point now, as the cost of climate inaction rises, and it's rising rapidly around the world, you can see where I am behind me. Everybody in this country lives in smoke all summer long. Everybody in this country is trying to figure out how they're going to live in 50-degree heat. That's going to cost a tremendous amount of money as we start to renew our infrastructure. We know that these things are all interconnected. And what we don't speak about is the economic benefits of moving towards renewable, sustainable solutions. We don't do that enough. So people think this is all just going to cost a hell of a lot of money rather than thinking it's actually going to save more than that. Secondly, I would say I'm glad to see the NDP signing on to what Greens have been talking about for years about building a national electrical grid. We know that this can be done, should be done. And we think that the idea of building pipelines, the idea that Mark Carney, the UN climate envoy, should actually speak of building pipelines, of developing more conventional energy, is really astonishing. I saw Mr. Carney in Glasgow and in Dubai speaking about the need for the transition. And it came to my mind when he talked about those things. In Glasgow, he rounded up $126 trillion, he said, from some of his friends in the banking business. And I thought, oh, these are all bankers. And what I know about bankers is they always want the money back, and generally with a little something extra on top, a little vigorish, as the loan shark used to say. And speaking in Dubai, there were panels of people talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars that they were going to use to fund the energy transition. And it occurred to me, I'm not an economist like Mark, but I've studied some economics, that these people are not engaged in or interested in any kind of energy abundance that can come from low-cost renewables like solar and other things. They're interested still in the economic scarcity because that's how you make money. So I think we can bring these things together when we talk to people about the cost of living, which is the current economic crisis facing voters, and say these things are all interconnected in every way possible. Thanks.
Well, they are interconnected, but Mark, as you have talked about before, what's the cost associated with us going through the transition? What's the cost of reducing GHGs? What's the cost of creating those other sources of sustainable power? Can we do it? And how important is it that when we're portraying this, we're portraying it in realistic timelines?
So remind me of the timelines, but I want to go straight to your question, and then you can let my three panelists take shots at me, because I think they're going to want to, and I'll tell you why. And I mean, you had mentioned it before we went on air. A book I did in 2005 called "Sustainable Fossil Fuels," in
the introduction.
In the introduction,
yeah.
And what I think humans are challenged with in this, one of the big things that challenges us is a need for everything to be good and everything to be bad. And so, okay, fossil fuels, they must not only be bad because they're polluting the atmosphere and therefore causing climate change, which will have grave costs, but they also must be more expensive than the alternatives. Well, the experts show they're not. They must be bad for local human health. Well, an expert like Kirk Smith, who's now passed away at Berkeley, who I worked with on the global energy assessment, showed me how getting propane, butane, kerosene into villages around the world over the last 100 years saved millions of lives per year. That fossil fuels were wonderful for human health. So you get all that and you're like, oh, shoot, I wish they were all bad. And the alternatives, renewables and so on, were all good. Actually, renewables, I mean, I was going to jump in earlier with Suki when he mentioned renewables. We can do renewables so it's really unsustainable. We can build a hydro dam in some area that silts up within a few decades. We can deforest areas for biomass. There's so many ways that we can do renewables that are non-sustainable. The other cognitive dissonance on the fossil fuel side, if you're in the fossil fuel industry, if you make your living from it, then it's so hard to get you to just realize, yes, they're wonderful for so many things, but our combustion of them is wrecking the planet. So you're going to have to hold two thoughts in your brain at the same time. And that's going to mean some really interesting challenges. And I think some of the more climate-sincere politicians around the world, and I can give you examples, but even just think of the government of Norway in the last few decades, have had to say, we're a fossil fuel producer, but we also want to have zero-emission transportation, zero-emission buildings, zero-emission industry, and help other parts of the world do the same thing so that eventually the demand for our fossil fuels will disappear. But you've got to hold all of that stuff together. Fossil fuels are really cheap, and they'll get cheaper as we use less of them. The Earth's crust is full of them.
Tom, you want to start by taking a shot at him?
I'll stay quiet now.
And I know, Suki, I know you want to jump in there, but Tom, we can't leave you on the sidelines here.
I'll take a beating now.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Well, I'm not sure if I actually want to take a shot at what Mark had to say, because he really lays out the benefits and downside not only of fossil fuels but also of other energy sources. And I think ultimately we would be better served by having a bigger, more informed conversation from a wider sector of the population. In the current leaders' debates that we just had in the federal election, there are a few interesting comments about climate change and energy, but it could go way deeper and way broader. And some of the statements made, I think the politicians are kind of relying on the public not to be able to see through them. The solution for that is more journalists writing about climate and energy issues and more people learning about them more, and generally a cultural shift to become more aware of this sort of foundation of our whole society rather than just enjoying the fruits of consumerism.
Tom, do you believe that we can have this transition where we're moving from one to the other, not saying this has to end now and that has to begin tomorrow?
Well, of course.
As far as I know, society has never tried to change this big. And so I'm enthusiastically pushing in favor of it, but I don't know if humanity is capable of it. It's a big change.
John, Suki was up next, but in response to that, I had done some reading once that said it took 50 years in the United States for the main source of transportation to go from being a horse to an automobile. Like 50 years, because it takes time for new systems to get into place, infrastructure to be there. And the two coexisted for a very long time as sources of individual transportation. We're going through a transition where we need to have this combination. Suki.
But it has to be a just transition. And the issue is, we've even heard from the Liberal leader, Mark Carney, initially the plan was 2030. Now it's becoming 2035. What's going to happen in another 5 years from now? 2040? The issue is, every time we keep pushing the inevitable, you could say, forward, it just means that there's less incentive for everyday Canadians and for businesses to make that transition. Because from a public policy, governmental aspect, they keep changing. So it's so important that we really kind of set a firm deadline and try to work towards it. And if we miss it, then let's say, okay, an extra year, an extra 2 years, not go by 5 or 10 years. When a government goes by that amount of time, it's just basically kicking the can down the road. And I just want to make one point, is that in Canada, we are actually the second highest emitter of CO2. We are 17 tons
total per capita.
I was going to say. So 17 tons of CO2 per head. And that's quite a lot for a small nation, right, per capita. So we do have an issue here. And we need to realign our thoughts, our objectives, our policies with the science. Because the problem is, we can keep talking about kicking the can down the road, but the problem is Mother Nature, the climate, it's not going to wait for us.
So is that consumers that are like the guilty parties here, or is it heavy industry?
Well, I have a saying, blame the producers, not the consumers. At the end of the day, if the public don't have a choice but to burn fossil fuels, they have no choice. We have to give public choice, right? We need to ensure that producers get on board and they start transitioning. So then everyone can then start changing their behavior.
Mark, I saw you react, but I got to go to John first. John?
A couple of points. First of all, I totally agree with Mark. If you make your living from fossil fuels, you find this a frightening situation. And governments in Canada make their livings from fossil fuels. It's our largest source of exports. They charge royalties on it. That's how governments make a lot of money. Hence, governments are not eager to move off fossil fuels to, for instance, trying to figure out a way to get royalties from sunshine. That's a much more difficult thing to do. Secondly, when we keep talking about transition, what we are actually talking about is disruption. And disruption can be, and is always, comes on more rapidly than people think it will, and always moves more rapidly. Stuart, you talked about having 100 years of coexistence with automobiles and horses. That's true, but in New York City, for instance, it took 10 years to almost entirely replace the automobile. And that had massive effects on the economy of people who spread manure on farms, and on and on and on and on and on it went. Economists always underestimate how rapidly disruption is going to happen in every single example in history. And it always happens with greater effects and has greater beneficial effects than anticipated. So when we look at the changes from, well, just from cars to horses, when we look at changes to digital photography, you look at the phones, you look at all of these things, they always move more rapidly, always, than economists predict. And I know Mark's written a lot of books. I've only written one. It's this one here called Climate Change for Dummies. Whoops, I can't get it on the screen somehow. I'm not sure why how's that working that way. Anyway, this is bizarre.
Blame it on a fossil fuel.
Climate change for dummies. And in writing this, we had to learn to work within the format of the dummies editors, which consists of a substantial amount of not dumbing down, but really getting clarity in everything you say. When we talk about net zero by 2030, that's really nonsensical. If we've exceeded the world's carbon budget by that time, it doesn't matter. The carbon budget, what's important. Net zero by 2030 is a marketing slogan, or by 2035 or 2050. The carbon budget drives these things. So there's any number of things that we talk about in the political arena which don't jibe with the realities of disruption. And we've been saying, if we don't plan for the disruption, we won't have a just transition. We will have a massively unjust disruption because people will be bang out of work within 10, 15 years, not a gentle pace, moving on slowly, gradually in a planned manner. I can go on, but I'll stop and leave some space for others. Thanks.
Lots for you to dig into there, Mark.
Yeah, but it's you guys could have been harder on me, so I'm feeling spared. But I have a couple of comments. Well, one is just early in your beginning, I think, I'm not sure how you were set up for this, but net zero by 2030, you said, and I think you meant by 2050. So
I kept hearing different.
Yeah.
It was
so
2030, 2050. 2050. I go, that's a good goal.
So in the last federal election, the four main parties, I don't know about the bloc, had different targets.
Right.
So the Conservatives said 30% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. Liberals said 40, NDP said 50, Greens said 60. And so nobody's been saying net zero by 2030. But by 2050, almost everybody's agreed on that. It's safe enough into the distance. The Liberals are now have set a 2035, and other people are talking about that. But what I wanted to get at was, and this can help maybe trigger a bigger discussion here, which is more focused on policy. As I explained in that most recent book, because it's a global problem, you might say, oh, it feels good to blame industry. Let's blame our steel industry, our aluminum industry, or our oil and gas industry, because they're the ones who are emitting and maybe even forcing us to buy gasoline and so on. You could try to do that. But what the example I gave of Norway, you start to realize, oh my goodness, so you're going to go after your industry for its emissions and ask it to compete globally when other jurisdictions are not going after industry and raising their costs. And this is why a lot of people who've worked on this problem for a long time, from Bill Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winner, they've said, you got to do things domestically. You do have to blame consumers. You don't get the free ride of just saying it's those horrible, selfish industrialists, barons, wealthy. It's actually us. We have to stop burning gasoline. We have to stop burning heating oil or natural gas in our buildings. And so leading jurisdictions in the world are working on policies like that. And they're mostly giving industry a free ride. And this is even where they have social democratic governments in Scandinavia. So NDP type governments. When Scandinavia's had a carbon tax for a very long time. Okay, Sweden, let's take Sweden to give you one number, but they all have them. Sweden's, I had to explain to people 8 or 9 years ago that the Swedish carbon tax was $150 per ton of CO2. We got to about 80 in Canada. So it was double what we got to for individual homeowners buying gasoline. Wow. What was it for an industry, a steel mill or whoever who had to buy gasoline for their trucks, for their factories, whatever? It was $5. Let me say that again, $150 from a social democratic NDP type government for individual consumers, $5 for industrial. Why? Because the industrialists are competing internationally. You cannot hammer your industry. So there's a good dilemma for people because it's not convenient to worldviews. It's troubling.
Suki?
So, you do make some valid points, for sure. It is going to cost money. Either way, someone's going to bear the brunt. Is it going to be these big industries that are going to bear the brunt, bear the cost, with whatever tax we charge people, either directly or indirectly? Or is it going to be individuals through wildfires, through the thawing permafrost, which is actually quite an issue right now. For instance, what I've heard is that we have a frozen permafrost right now, which is thawing due to the climate emergency. And we have in that ground about 1,500 billion tons locked in the Arctic permafrost. If we are not quick enough to try and change our behaviors and transition to more of a green, zero emitting climate, we're going to have twice the amount of the current CO2 getting released into our atmosphere. And actually not just CO2, but methane emissions combined, because we also know that methane, even though it's been painted as a clean energy, is actually 80 times more harmful than CO2 because it stays in the atmosphere for much longer, for 20 years. So we also need to think about the other aspects, the wildfires. How many people right now in Florida and California can afford insurance? They have to depend on the state now for their insurance. So individuals are going to be affected either way. It depends, how do we want to do this? Do we want to do this a hard way, or do we want to try and do this a different way, where everyone pays in to this transition?
We did a panel in Calgary earlier, I guess in the fall, and Peter Tzatzakian, the well-known energy pundit, there was on that panel, and he talked, and we were looking at Alberta's sequestering potential advantage. And he brought up a really interesting point. He said, CO2 from heavy emitters, it's a waste disposal problem. And we need to charge them with saying, this is a waste product that you have. You have to take care of it. I thought it was an interesting concept. But it comes back to, okay, well then, what are the innovative tools that we can put into place to actually make that happen so that the industry stay competitive? Part of that, and what is a big part of what we're doing, supposed to be talking about today, is what are those sustainable energy alternatives that can be introduced? What are we working on that we can say, look, this is giving us hope? So Tom, where's the industry at right now? And it's because it's way more than just wind and solar.
You mean the sustainable energy industry?
Yes. Yeah. Where are we at? Like, what are some of the innovative forms of sustainable energy that we can look at and say, my gosh, that's creative and it's happening here in British Columbia?
I'll say wind power and solar power very definitely have shown very positive or descending cost curves that make them very practical and competitive now. BC Hydro has just had a call for clean power, and all the winners have been wind projects and one solar project. So we can look forward to that. And the cost, average cost was $74 per megawatt hour, which is equivalent to 7.4 cents. So that's keeping costs down, lower than they were a decade or so ago. But I'll keep on plugging also for increase in energy efficiency, which is not flamboyant or attractive so much to people, but it's critically important if we want eventually to solve the problem. We have to control our overall levels of use.
I agree with you. I think energy efficiency and what we're doing in building design, in the way in which we're heating buildings and so on. I'm going to give a shout out to Lynn Mueller at Shark, a Coquitlam-based company here that collects wastewater from buildings, converts that in energy into heat to reheat buildings and produce hot water, not just for the building that the water may have come from, but within neighborhoods. And it's already at work here in Vancouver. You take a look at it in Olympic Village. This is technology. And so what's it doing? It's reducing the amount of energy that's required. Mark, what are some of the sort of bright lights from your perspective that you go, we are leaders?
So, I mean, we're leaders in large hydro. Now, this is a legacy. And I'm not saying I supported Site C, but Site C has enormous benefits, because even when you talk about that cost of wind and cost of solar, it's a non-dispatchable form of electricity. So economists like me don't even allow you to compare costs like that. They say, we need to know, how did you firm up that wind and solar? So when you do try to compare your options, you have to be very careful. And we energy economists will jump all over you in that area. When we talk about energy efficiency, I do have one thing to bring up, because energy efficiency is what I was working on 3 decades ago, and I sort of, what got me into the Royal Society was some of the innovations I did in how to understand and cost it. And I have to tell you that if somebody wants to slow walk the effort on climate, they love to talk about energy efficiency, because it's like, oh, so we're not going to talk fuel switching. When you look at the jurisdictions that are making now, and almost all industrial countries now are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and per capita they're plummeting. But when we rank out and make tables of the success, it's when, yes, they've done energy efficiency, but they've understood that they need to do fuel switching. Otherwise, energy efficiency is kind of a way of avoiding fuel switching. It's like, oh, we'll just focus on energy efficiency. And ironically, though, the two big fuel switching things we might do, like heating your house with an electric heat pump instead of a natural gas furnace, is an enormous energy efficiency gain. But it starts with a fuel switch. And it's the same thing, an electric car instead of an internal combustion gasoline engine is far more efficient. But ironically, these things are happening not because of efficiency policy, but because of fuel switching policy. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. And it's like one of those things, like hit yourself in the head. Stop burning fossil fuels. When we make big gains in energy efficiency, there is a rebound effect to that. That means we can get wealthier and we consume more in various areas. So there's a whole literature on that. So I'm not against energy efficiency. I'm with Tom on that, but I just want to have a qualifying, careful comment about that.
I'll go to John and come to you. John, your response to this?
Fuel switching for sure, Mark, is what needs to be the prime focus. I absolutely agree. I just want to point out, Suki, when we talk about costs, it's actually time for us to bring to the Canadian public, we spend somewhere between $2.5 to $5 billion a year giving money to fossil fuel companies. These are companies that say the market is demanding what they have. Well, then let's let them stand on their own and do what they can. The price for West Texas Intermediate oil is $62 today. There's no going to be drill, baby, drill at $62. The OPEC countries are starting to open up supplies because they can see that demand is going to peak soon, and they're not going to be able to sell the stuff anymore. Fuel switching is what has to happen. For the Canadian government to be continuing to promote and push and subsidize the production of fossil fuels is just absurd, absolutely absurd. And I want to go back to Norway for a second, if I can. Mark knows, and you others may recall, that what Norway did when they opened up the North Sea was they did put in place a state-owned oil company, Statoil, modeled on Canada's Petrochem, so that they knew what oil companies were making so that they could charge the highest possible royalties to make as much money as possible from that oil. Secondly, they said we put all that money in the bank. None of it goes to the current account. Thirdly, they said where we're going to get our economic gain is from having Norway be the supplier of expertise in the oil field. So still all around the world, the divers, the drillers, etc., a lot of them are Norwegian. We took a whole different approach. After Mr. Trudeau's, the previous Mr. Trudeau, Canadian energy plan was savaged. Then Mr. Mulroney turned the oil patch over to the private sector, and we charge minimal royalties in Alberta, minimal royalties in Canada, in Alberta, sorry. We gave up on the ideas that Norway has pursued successfully for many years. That's why Norway now is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. There's 6 million people, just like 4 million, just like BC, are incredibly wealthy because they managed the system, and they're now managing the disruption, not the transition, but the disruption as they move on. So anyway, thanks.
Suki.
I'm glad we're actually talking about the money. It's always about the money, isn't it? So let's just, also talk about how much the oil and gas industry is being subsidized. So we're talking about $12 billion of public money that's gone into oil and gas. We're talking about $1.8 billion of tax breaks in just 1 year to oil and gas. And Export Development Canada specifically has provided $6.4 billion in public financing to oil and gas projects. All this money should be diverted. It should be going to more renewable resources. And another thing just to also mention on the side here is that there is already a fund, a $15 billion fund, that hasn't really been spent much since 2016. So we also need to start spending the money. And for the NDP specifically, we want to bring down that energy usage in households, going back to Mark's point. We definitely agree about switching fuel sources into something that is more renewable, sustainable, like hydro, and being able to give everyone the ability for retrofitting their home, giving everyone those subsidies, similar to what the BC government has done, but more on a federal, national level. It's necessary. The federal government has to be able to come in and provide that funding, divert that, what I would call dirty money, polluting money, subsidies, into something much cleaner and more sustainable in that aspect.
So I'm going to bring the discussion back to how do we transition? We say that we're wanting to transition fuels. How do we do that? Who are the players? And I can't help but think that the very industry that we want to hammer over the head can play an important role. Mark?
Yeah, so I'm really glad with what you're just talking about, Stu, because I wanted to try to at least make sure people understood that as we get rid of a carbon tax, there are other policies out there that have been implemented in British Columbia, starting with Gordon Campbell, who did regulations and then followed on by the NDP, and then federally since 2015 that have gone on. And Pierre Poilievre promises to get rid of virtually every one of those.
Right.
But for people like me, who've never really cared that much about carbon pricing, because I knew you could do it with regulations, and the key thing is for a climate-sincere government to stay alive, to stay in power, to keep doing good things. I've always been interested in those regulations. I'll make one comment about fossil fuel subsidies, and I'll just say, be careful of our sources. Around economists who have studied fossil fuel subsidies for a very long time, the numbers are all over the map. I had the misfortune in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to be the lead author who got saddled with all of the research in the world on subsidies to fossil fuels. And when someone shoots out some numbers, I'm very cautious about that. Some of the things we call subsidies aren't necessarily subsidies. It depends on what we're doing in our mining sectors with accelerated depreciation. Are we giving a fossil fuel company a tax write-off because they're doing carbon capture and storage? Is that a subsidy or isn't? A large pipeline, I would agree, may very well be a subsidy if the private sector couldn't do it. But what I want to get at then is we have policies that affect us, and I'll say not so much first of all, the output-based pricing system. That exists in Canada today. It's Canada-wide. Different provinces can have their own version of it, as Quebec and Alberta do. And it doesn't dramatically raise the cost of production for our exporting or competing industries, but it does incentivize them to make some real progress in things like carbon capture and storage, in many ways of reducing their emissions. That's a really important policy to hang on to, in my view. And I was very disappointed to see Pierre Poilievre say that he would get rid of that. An election previously, Aaron O'Toole was wedded to keeping that policy. Similar policies like the zero-emission vehicle mandate. Somewhere in Canseco's survey, he said that all vehicles had to be 100% electric in 2030 or 2035. That's not actually what the policy is. 20% of those cars can be plug-in hybrid electric. They can have gasoline engines. So our policies are not as restrictive as some people have deliberately portrayed them as. Maybe you need to change them. That's a critical policy. You don't need to have a carbon tax if you have that policy in the personal transportation sector. And there's a bunch of other examples like that, the Clean Fuel Standard, the Clean Electricity Regulation, the methane regs. I could go on, but I shouldn't exceed my share.
No, but I want to come back to my question to you. What role can the fossil fuel sector play in helping us with this transition? Because they have infrastructure in place. They know how to distribute energy.
Oh, okay. I'll let others say, but it is, okay, fair enough. A lot of what we're doing now is thinking about geothermal energy? Is there something where people who can drill can help with that? There's some really interesting stuff going on. But you can use fossil fuels to get electricity with zero emissions. You can use fossil fuels to get hydrogen that you use with zero emissions in the whole production process. So that's why I wrote that book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels. You can go on for hundreds of years in a zero emission global energy system using lots of fossil fuels.
Suki, and then I'll come to you, John. I know that.
Touching back on your point, to produce energy by burning fossil fuels, you're still going to be burning it, even if it's going back into the ground.
My examples are not burning it.
Well,
it's called pre-combustion conversion. It's a Fischer-Tropsch process that was created by the Germans. It's already being done in the world right now and burying the CO2.
But we still need to do a lot more research. And I think this is an aspect for not just for fossil fuels, but for all resources. I'll give you an example. We're talking about nuclear technology. It is starting to change. Obviously, we have the traditional nuclear power plant, but now with ongoing scientific developments, there is a possibility where we can create small nuclear power plants, which are actually much safer than the conventional nuclear reaction that goes on right now. I think that's fusion technology or fission. I think it's fission, splitting atoms. So I think going back to your question, in regards to the current industry, I think they definitely do have a big role to play. They have the skills, they have the capital, they have the infrastructure. Let's work with them to try and do this transition, because without them we can't, right? Let's just be honest. So we need to definitely wave a carrot somewhere. But what type of carrot is a different question, and maybe is open to lots of different perspectives. But yeah, we definitely should be using those skills. We don't want, people in Alberta to just get jobless because we're shutting down the oil and gas industry.
John?
They've got those skills. Let's use that.
John?
Good point.
Yeah, a couple of things. I want to say, let's get back to the costs of not dealing with this issue. When we talk about the costs of the transition, it's going to cost this, it's going to cost that. What we don't talk about is what are the costs of not dealing with it. Insurers around the world are not just charging more, they're bailing out. They will no longer insure your dwelling if you live in a forested area in California, period. They will not insure my dwelling up in this country against overland water. It doesn't look like overland water happens up here much, but when you do get unbelievable rains, as we've been getting, you get flash floods and you get water and soil coming down these cliffs. These are present costs currently bearing on consumers and currently bearing on governments. They are going up exponentially as climate change moves on more rapidly. So in order to deal with this, we actually have to take the question of reducing carbon loading into the atmosphere as a serious temporal issue and do it right now. We just don't have time to do things like playing with the nuclear business. My God, it's going to take those guys 10 years to get prototypes. Then it'll take them another 5 to 7 to get feasible commercial operations. And then maybe we'll get something in place that might work. It's too late by that point. We've already loaded the atmosphere with enough carbon and the oceans with enough carbon that we're looking at hundreds of years baked into the system. We talked about the ocean currents changing. We know that these things are happening. These are costs we're bearing today. So what we can do to avoid those costs is to move as rapidly as we can to put fossil fuel producers out of business. They don't have any expertise in distributing energy except through pipes. They don't have any expertise they do have expertise in drilling wells, so we should be working on geothermal, no question about that. But we have to be focusing on electrifying the system as rapidly as we can and switching our fossil fuel subsidies to subsidies for sustainable, renewable energy deliveries and putting those things in place quickly. The costs are right now. It's not a cost sometime in the future from not doing it. It's costs that we're bearing today. Thanks.
So I have a question to you that has come in, and in some ways it addresses what has been brought up more than once. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And as we continue to grow within our understanding of how climate functions and the way that it interacts with human activity, what it needs to be done so that future generations, as they're going through school, actually become climate and environment literate, like with real information. Should this become a part of the curriculum of all schools, not just piecemeal here and there? Mark, I'll start with you, and then we'll go through everybody, and then we're going to have to come to closing remarks because we'll run out of time.
I'll try to be really quick.
Yeah.
As I've dealt with this issue and seen it go up and down and seen the challenges of it being a long-term issue, I've come to the conclusion that humanity will most likely have limited and then finally perhaps large success in dealing with the climate challenge, and very few people will know we've done it. And sorry about that, Stu, but it's not something that will grip most people. So I remember doing radio shows, this is like 15 years ago, 20 years ago on climate, and people said we're going to educate the next generation, and then they grow up. This is probably 25 years ago, like on Bill Good's show. And so then I would say to people, okay, well, since I was a graduate student and so on, we addressed urban smog. Do you know how we did it? Like what causes smog and what were the policies? No idea. Okay, acid rain. Do you know how we dealt with that? Dioxin, like all ozone depleting substances, chlorofluorocarbons. In general, the way it'll probably work, if it's going to work, isn't everybody becomes aware, everybody thinks the same way, everybody wants the same thing, but instead enough people, some mixture of people with scientific knowledge and political commitment and political leadership and an ability to get in power and stay in power long enough to, let's say, close down the coal plants in Ontario. That's what we see. We see people stay in power for a long enough time, and a few at the margins are able to keep them in power, and they do the policy, and then the policy flips the situation. Norway is now only selling electric cars. How did that happen? It happened in 12 years. And that happened, and yet it's interesting. Yes, there's an awareness of climate change in Norway, but still, my colleagues who are pollsters there will tell me it's amazing how many people don't even know what was going on.
I find that surprising and distressing because I worry that we don't make informed choices if the general population, and to a large extent the people who are policy makers, don't have a level
but
of
I think
literacy.
You're selling us down the river because we're not going to get there, and so we're not going to solve this problem. If you're right.
From my perspective, we need to bring everybody on board, right? And climate education is really important because it gives people that awareness. It basically dispels the misinformation. But also you have to remember that every person who's at school right now will eventually become a voter.
Yes, they will.
Exactly. And they are going to be the future. And if they are educated and aware of the current situation of our climate emergency, hopefully they will choose the correct government that will bring around the correct policies and implementation in place to ensure that we have that transition. So I definitely think that climate education is essential. Okay, yes, they're not bringing in a specific solution, but we still need that awareness in everybody.
John, from your perspective, how important is climate literacy?
I think what is critically important is scientific literacy and mathematical literacy. And if you have those things, then you can understand. Without them, you're talking about some specific subject where people will just not get. Most politicians are innumerate. If you ask them what they know about exponential change, it's nothing at all. I have a little trick I do with one person in Sweden and one person in Ireland passed it. So I think we need to be educating all of us, not just our kids, about basic science so that we don't actually dwell in this world where, as I said to someone the other day, a long-standing phrase, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Secondly, I think that we should be engaging our young people with some civics education. How does our democracy actually work? We've got an election now that's being posed as a referendum question on which of two individuals should be prime minister. Nobody in the country, except the people who live in Nepean, can vote for Mark Carney, or who live in Carleton can vote for Pierre Poilievre. They vote for local members of parliament in their local jurisdictions. And if we don't understand how our government works And if we don't have a science and a mathematical understanding of how things and systems in general work, everyone is fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with these incredibly important questions. Thanks.
So we're out of time, but I want to give each of you 30 to 60 seconds just for some closing remarks. Tom, can I start with you?
Thanks. Yes, on the question of education, I do agree with a lot of what Mark said about the difficulty of informing people about about energy issues, and yet we do need to bring the society around to some kind of shift in values so that they'll be willing to accept the rather large changes that will be necessary if we're going to become energy sustainable. We can't go on having just a pure consumer society where the demand for more goods and services simply has no ceiling to it, and expect that to yield us a sustainable result. We need something. We need a new culture, I would say.
Suki, closing remarks from you.
Let's ensure that any subsidies in the energy sector go towards having this transition towards green energy, which is sustainable. And with that money, we can also help to retrofit homes, do all the small things as well as the large things. I think we should really have some kind of investment fund in the energy sector where we can look at different aspects of nuclear energy, tidal, and even biomass. So putting the money in the right place from a government policy perspective, I think is important in sustainability and ensuring that we are going to attain that net zero target.
John, closing thoughts from you.
I think we have to get pragmatic. When we talk about nuclear as a solution to this, when we talk even about geothermal, when we talk about tidal, all of these, the geothermal is different, but when we talk about tidal, nuclear, these things, they take years and years and years to develop. We do not have years and years and years. We have solar energy and battery, back to Mark's point about storage and about intermittency. Cost curves declining at a rate that looks like Moore's law for semiconductors. They're going down so fast that the International Renewable Energy Association just published a little study that says that last year there was 548 gigawatts of renewable energy installed last year to meet new power demand, and a very small fraction of fossil fuels coming up on that basis. I think we need to get pragmatic. We need to act rapidly, and that means dealing with cheap, available technology. It doesn't mean looking at pie in the sky. And we need also to deal with the fact that it's going to be very difficult for major industries to make a lot of money out of stacking little tiles together to make solar power. What we have to spend money on is the distribution. It's not the distribution of the battery storage. I think we should get focused on what we can do in the next 4 to 5 to 10 years to shift this curve. Otherwise, we are truly condemning ourselves to an unlivable future. Just look behind me at that picture. A lot of the world will look like that. Thanks.
Mark.
A lot of the voters today were actually educated on climate. This has been going on for a long time now. So those voters need to look to elect politicians who domestically will charge them, but hopefully do things to help with lower income people, but will charge them or regulate their choices, which will probably increase their energy costs, because that's what you have to do to get greenhouse gases down. Ironically, we're talking here on Earth Day in 2025, and there's a Canadian federal election in which the contrast is quite stark. And I don't say this in sort of a partisan different parties. I actually helped Aaron O'Toole 4 years ago design a combination of carbon tax and regulations, and I've helped Greens, as John will know, and Liberals and NDP. But right now, someone promises, if elected, to remove all the policies that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and so they will go up. It's kind of an interesting contrast.
Well, I want to end on a little bit of optimism from my perspective. I believe that there are tremendous shifts underway, and that we are moving towards finding the ways to create the energy production that we're going to need. And I'll give you just one short example as my closing thought. You take a look at the work that Walter Merida is doing out at UBC. He's taken a parking lot and he's converted it, put solar panels on the top. You can only park in there if you've got an electric car. You show up in the morning, they need demand power to get the buildings in the area working. You plug your car in and the parking lot draws power from your car, which has been stored overnight, boosts the grid locally while the sun's coming up. They produce energy during the day, they recharge your car, but they also have enough energy to produce green hydrogen, which they're using and blending into other ways. And he's demonstrating it as a model to say, you can do that in this neighborhood, you can do it in that building over there, that there's an opportunity to cut down on energy production, but still fit in with what are innovative opportunities that are, or manners of producing power, and moving towards this objective of saying, we want to make sure that, going back to our original point, that we're producing sustainable energy, not just for now, but into the future. This has been a lively conversation. I thank all of you, and for all of you who watched or haven't, please know that it's recorded, it'll be available online, and we'll also be distributing quite a wide variety of clips from today's session on social media. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all of our panelists, and to the panelists who are here in studio. You get to take home your coveted Conversations Live water mug. Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning into Conversations Live, an Oh Boy Productions program. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find our previous and upcoming episodes at conversationslive.ca. You can also follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you. I'm Stuart McNish.